A 2-year-old girl vanished in a blizzard. No footsteps, no sound. Just dots in the snow like Morse code. 3 days later, she was found alive, curled beside the frozen body of a white fox. No one knew why the animal died to protect her, but that was only the beginning of a buried truth. Subscribe now to uncover the chilling story that shook everything we thought we knew. The storm hadn't arrived yet, but the wind already whispered of something ancient, something watching. Montana stretched wide beneath a bruised gray sky, the clouds low and swollen, like a ceiling on the verge of collapse. The pine trees along the ridge leaned eastward, their tips dancing in the rising gusts, casting long shadows over the small clearing where a single orange and brown canvas tent crouched like a waiting heartbeat. Inside, the soft crackle of a battery lantern hummed against the canvas, casting gentle glows that flickered over sleeping bags and fleece blankets. 2-year-old Lila Summers sat cross-legged in her tiny footy pajamas, her face dappled with light as she turned the pages of a cloth book. She didn't read not yet, but she hummed as if the colors and shapes sang to her. Wisps of honey-colored hair curled against her forehead, and her cheeks flushed pink from the cold, seeping through the seams of the tent. Her eyes, large and luminous blue, were locked in that dreamy state only toddlers knew, somewhere between imagination and instinct. Outside, her parents were setting up the camp stove, their breaths visible in short, tired bursts. Ava, her mother, was in her early 30s with warm eyes but furrowed brows, the kind of woman who never let her guard down, except for Lila. Daniel, the father, was fiddling with the propane hose, kneeling next to a pile of firewood still damp from snowmelt. A radio perched on the corner of a folding table sputtered out static, and then a clipped voice. Severe winter front moving in from the northwest. Wind gusts up to 60 miles per hour. Whiteout conditions likely by midnight. Repeat, whiteout conditions likely. Ava paused, exchanging a glance with Daniel. We should pack up and head down, she said. Her voice was soft, but edged with urgency. Daniel exhaled, rubbing a gloved hand over his stubbled jaw. It's 2 hours to the truck. You really want to hike that in the dark? The storm's coming. He stood dusting snow off his jeans. Let's give it another hour. If it looks worse, we move. Inside the tent, Lila giggled suddenly, without warning, without cause. Ava turned. You okay, Bug? No answer. Just another soft laugh, like she was seeing something delightful no one else could. Snow began to fall again. By 9:00 p.m., the sky was ink. No stars, no moon, just a relentless darkness pressing downward. The lantern inside the tent flickered as the cold grew teeth. Ava zipped Lila snug in her sleeping bag, placing her favorite stuffed rabbit, one ear missing, next to her. You stay warm, okay? Mommy's just outside. Lila nodded slowly, but her eyes never left the top of the tent. Something held her gaze a space between canvas and night. Ava kissed her forehead. Back in a minute. She zipped the flap and stepped into the wind. Daniel was struggling with the stove again, muttering curses. The flame sputtered, then died. It's the damn regulator. They leaned into each other, shielding the ignition with their coats, trying again. The wind howled like something alive, clawing at their clothes, tugging hair loose. In the distance, a branch cracked like a gunshot. Ava's head snapped up. Did you hear that? Probably just the trees. No, she said slowly. It was closer. A tin rattle echoed from the supply box near the back of the clearing. Ava turned, eyes narrowing. The chain latch was swaying despite no one having touched it. I'll check it, she said, already moving. She disappeared behind the tent. The wind roared louder. Daniel fumbled with a lighter. Come on. And then a sound. Faint. A whimper. He looked up. Ava. Silence. Then her voice urgent. Daniel. He ran. She was standing outside the tent flap, frozen. The zipper was halfway open. Her hands trembled. I just checked. Daniel stepped beside her, looked inside. And the world stopped. The sleeping bag was empty. The rabbit lay on its side, its one ear pointing to the wall. No Lila. No sound. No footprints. Just a gentle indentation in the center of the sleeping bag, still warm. And on the floor of the tent near the zipper, snow. Not blown in, but settled. Perfectly in a circle. Ava stumbled back. She was just here. I zipped the flap. Daniel shouted her name into the woods. No response. He sprinted outside, flashlight swinging wildly. Snow spiraled around him, thick and clinging. Nothing. Just pine trees. And silence. Not even the wind dared interrupt. Ava dropped to her knees inside the tent, clutching the sleeping bag like it could offer answers. Her breathing came in shallow bursts. Then she saw it. Near the entrance, tiny dots in the snow. Not footprints, not handprints, dots. Arranged in 2 vertical lines, 4 in each line, equal spacing. Almost deliberate, like punctuation or code. Her mind rejected it, then returned to it. Daniel came back. No sign, no trail. It's like she vanished into the air. I found marks, Ava whispered. But they're wrong. He followed her gaze. Bent down, touched the first dot. It was shallow, circular, cold but not melting, like it hadn't been made by heat but placed gently. Animal. Ava shook her head. Too clean. Too intentional. She reached into her coat, pulled out her phone. No signal. Tried the satellite beacon. No green light. Dead. They were alone. Completely. The wind returned soft at first, then rising again with a ghostly voice, rustling through trees, snapping at tarp edges. Daniel tried the emergency radio. Static. He slammed it down. We need to move. Now. Find help. I'm not leaving without her. His voice cracked. Ava. She's gone. Her eyes turned to steel. Then I'll go where she went. She unzipped the tent, fully stepped out. The wind rose to meet her. Daniel followed, grabbing the last working flashlight. They circled the clearing, combing for any sign. Half an hour passed. An hour. Then just as Daniel turned back toward camp, he saw something at the edge of his beam. On the tree trunk. Scratches. Not random. Not animal. A pattern. 4 slashes, then 3 dots below. Again like code. He stepped closer. Ava beside him. They counted more symbols further up the ridge, all pointing toward the forest's spine. The direction the wind came from. Ava gripped his arm. She's not alone. Daniel wanted to argue. But something inside him, some instinct old as fire, told him she was right. Something had taken her, but not to harm her. To show something. The snow intensified. Visibility dropped. They returned to the tent for shelter. And then came the whisper. Soft, barely audible, from just beyond the tree line. One word. Echo. They froze. It was Lila's voice, but impossibly distant. And yet, in the clearing, the snow settled again in that strange pattern. Dots. Clean. Repeating. And then, gone. Darkness swallowed the forest, and the storm finally began. The world Logan Hart built for himself wasn't much, but it was quiet. A one-room cabin, hand-built from pine and silent decisions, sat pressed between 2 ridges in northern Montana. No address, no mail, no electricity save for a solar panel salvaged from a ranger station 20 miles away. No one knew he lived there. No one had ever been invited. And that was how he liked it. Outside, the trees groaned beneath the weight of the coming storm. Thick flurries drifted down slow at first, then faster, dancing between the icicle-laced eaves. Inside, the fire cracked quietly in the cast-iron stove. Logan sat at the table, hunched over a battered journal, though he hadn't written in it in days. He simply flipped the pages back and forth, letting his fingers remember the handwriting, the sketches, the places he'd been and wished he hadn't. The wind pressed against the window pane, a hollow moan threading through the boards like a voice long buried. Logan didn't flinch. He was used to ghosts. He reached for his coffee cold. Took a sip anyway. His eyes drifted to the radio on the shelf above the woodpile. Old analog shortwave. Another relic? He hadn't turned it on in months, but something pulled him now. A twitch. A shift in the air. He stepped across the creaky plank floor and flicked the knob. White noise hissed through the cabin, crawling under the walls. Then, child missing, further north. Frost Ridge Basin. Name Lila Summers. Age 2. Presumed last seen around 900 p.m. Weather conditions deteriorating. Search teams unable to proceed. Logan froze. The cup in his hand trembled slightly, sloshing the cold coffee over the rim. He hadn't heard that name, Frost Ridge, since before everything fell apart. He turned the volume up. Static danced with fragments of words. No leads. No footprints. Parents in shock. The report ended abruptly, swallowed by static once more. Logan clicked the radio off. He stood still for a moment, listening to the new silence that replaced the old one. Then he walked to the window. Outside, the snow was falling in earnest now, blanketing the trees and the trail that wound unseen between them. But that wasn't what held his gaze. It was something on the porch. Small, white, still. Logan narrowed his eyes. A fox. At first he thought it might have been a trick of the light, but no, it moved. A white fox. Unnaturally white. The color of untouched paper. Its coat shimmered like fresh frost, almost blending into the world around it. But its eyes, those were unmistakable. They were deep amber, almost gold, glowing faintly beneath the overhang. And they were fixed entirely on him. Logan stepped closer to the window. The fox didn't move. Then he saw it blood. A dark line smeared the snow beneath its back leg. Nothing gushing, but steady. It had been wounded. Still, it stood tall, head up, tail resting across the porch like a waiting sentinel. What the hell? Logan muttered. He moved to the door, grabbing his coat from the hook, slipped into his boots, opened the latch. The wind hit him like a cold slap. But the fox remained unbothered. They stared at each other for several long seconds. Then slowly Logan lowered himself to one knee. He extended a gloved hand. "Hey there, easy now," he said softly, voice hoarse from disuse. "I'm not going to hurt you." The fox tilted its head slightly. It didn't back away. Instead, it stepped forward once. A cautious, calculated motion. Closer, another step, and another, until it stood just beyond Logan's outstretched hand. Then to his disbelief it sat, calmly, as if it had come with purpose. Logan exhaled a slow breath, clouding the space between them. His eyes traced the blood on its leg, high on the haunch clean puncture likely from a trap. Not deep enough to kill, but enough to slow. "Someone hurt you," he murmured. The fox blinked slowly, as if in reply. Logan reached behind him, pulled the door open wider. "Come inside. I'll clean it." He didn't expect it to work. Wild animals didn't behave this way. Injured ones, even less so. But the fox stood, walked past him, into the cabin. No hesitation. Logan followed, heart-hammering, mind spinning. He closed the door and bolted it. The fox sat near the fire, watching the flames, as if it knew what they meant. Logan knelt beside his supply chest, pulling gauze scissors and antiseptic from a weathered tin. He approached carefully, crouching. The fox shifted slightly but did not move away. He cleaned the wound in silence. The fox winced once, but remained still, its breathing steady. "Someone taught you to trust," he said quietly. "Or maybe you just chose to." When he finished wrapping the leg, the fox looked at him again. That stare intent, knowing not the stare of an animal, wondering if you're friend or food. This was different. Logan leaned back against the wall, breathing slowly. For the first time in months, maybe years, he felt something crack open. Not joy, not even peace. Just attention, presence. He looked at the journal still open on the table. A sketch of a face peered out from the last page, childlike, drawn in hurried pencil lines. A girl he had once failed. Her name had been Rachel. He closed the journal gently. "Another child's missing," he said to the room. "And this storm's not stopping." The fox's ears flicked toward him. "I'm not who I used to be," he muttered. "I'm not—" He stopped. Outside, the wind howled louder. A branch slammed against the window pane with a bang. Then something else. Distant. A low humming sound, barely audible. He crossed to the door, unlatched it. The wind nearly tore it from his hands, but he saw it now, barely in the distance. A glow. Not the moon, not fire. Movement. People. Too many to be search and rescue. And they weren't using floodlights or sirens. Logan narrowed his eyes. They moved in lines, synchronized, silent. Then they vanished behind the tree line. He shut the door, latched it hard, turned to the fox. It was standing now, facing the door, waiting. "You came to get me?" he whispered. The fox turned its head toward him just for a second, then turned back to the door. Logan nodded slowly. He strapped on his boots, pulled his coat tighter, grabbed the satchel he hadn't touched in years, still packed with a field radio signal jammer's old IDs. He paused only once. At the mirror by the door, his reflection looked back at him, older, sharper. Scar over his right eye, thin beard. The weight of 10 years he couldn't give back. But in his gaze, something shifted. "Resolve." He looked at the fox. "Let's go find her." The fox padded to the door, its gate limping but steady. Logan opened the door, and together man and fox vanished into the storm. The cold had teeth now. It gnawed at the gaps, and Logan's sleeves slipped beneath his collar, bit into the soft skin of his neck like a whisper with an edge. Still he pressed on boots crunching against crusted snow, eyes fixed on the fox limping just ahead. Its pace never faltered. Even wounded, the creature moved with purpose through the bramble, over uneven rises, under frozen limbs that creaked and swayed like mourners. Logan said nothing. He didn't have to. Something about the animal's presence silenced him more than fear or awe. It was the kind of silence born from recognition, the kind you offered when a sacred thing passed by and asked you to follow. The wind no longer howled, it whispered. He pulled his scarf tighter across his face, more to protect against the weight of the moment than the wind. His pack clanked lightly with the medical kit, a flask, and an old service pistol he hadn't drawn in nearly 6 years. It wasn't for defense, it was for endings. But he didn't tell himself that aloud. The fox veered sharply left. Logan hesitated. The trail it chose plunged into denser woods, deeper, darker, unbroken snow coating the earth like polished marble. No paths, no prints, no way markers. "No way. Where the hell are you going?" he muttered through clenched teeth, breath fogging. The fox turned slightly, just its head locking eyes with him. Then it moved forward again, without hesitation, its tail trailing behind like a white flame. Logan followed. He didn't know why. Not exactly. Logic screamed to stop. The temperature was dropping fast, single digits now. The clouds overhead churned in layers like bruises smeared across the sky. And the terrain wasn't just unfriendly, it was predatory. But there was something pulling him. Not just the creature, something more. He didn't have words for it, not yet. But it felt like momentum, like inevitability, like fate dressed in fur. He moved quietly, scanning the snowpack like he had during training days, searching for depressions, patterns, shifts in texture. But it was a clean sheet. The snowfall had erased everything, except the prints of the fox. And those weren't consistent. Sometimes they vanished for feet at a time. Sometimes they doubled back in spirals before correcting. Once Logan was sure the paw prints led into a tree, then reappeared 20 feet past it, as though the creature had never touched ground in between. None of it made sense, and somehow that comforted him. It meant he wasn't the one breaking, at least not alone. He checked his watch, then looked skyward. Judging by the light, dusk would fall soon. The forest had that pre-twilight hush, that sense of the world preparing to vanish into monochrome. He stopped to sip from the flask, just water. Enough to keep focus. The fox paused, waiting. That was the strangest part. It waited. Every time Logan paused, every time he dropped to one knee, or took a breath, or adjusted his coat, the fox would stop, look back not with impatience, but with awareness, as if it knew his pace, as if it needed him alive. Another quarter-mile passed in silence. Then something new. The fox turned sharply again, trotting uphill toward a ridge where pine branches hung lower, snow-laden and drooping like tired arms. As Logan crested the hill, he saw it dangling from one of the lower branches, just at shoulder height. A child's mitten, bright pink, fleece, tiny. He rushed forward, heart lurching. The mitten was hooked delicately on a branch, like someone had placed it there with care. Not dropped, not torn away, arranged. The fox sat just beyond it, eyes on Logan. He reached out and took the mitten. It was cold but dry, sheltered by the pine. He turned it over. There, stitched along the wristband in tiny thread, LS. Lila Summers. He stared at the initials, like they were coordinates, like they might tell him something more than what he already knew. She'd been here. Recently. Logan scanned the area. No boot prints, no dragging marks, nothing. He knelt in the snow, brushing gently along the surface, with gloved fingers feeling for disturbances. And that's when he found it. A square of soft fabric half buried beneath snow, just to the right of the tree's trunk. He pulled it free slowly. It was a corner of a sleep blanket, the kind toddlers clung to like treasure. Pale blue, patterned with faded ducks and moons. And it had been folded, not crumpled, folded, like someone had laid it down as a marker. Or an offering. Logan's jaw tightened. He looked at the fox. It was still staring, waiting, not for permission, for belief. I don't know who you are, Logan said softly, holding up the blanket. But you're not just a fox, are you? The creature blinked slowly, then stood and moved again. Logan didn't hesitate this time. Whatever logic remained was crumbling under the weight of something older than doubt, something deeper. This wasn't a random trail. It wasn't instinct. It was a path. It had intention. The fox knew where she was. He was sure of it. The forest thickened. The snow deepened. Somewhere above, the sky broke open just enough for a sliver of late-day sun to pierce the canopy. It scattered light like shattered glass across the snow, and in that moment, Logan saw it. A single set of prints. Tiny. Boot-shaped. Walking. Not running. Heading east. Jesus Christ, he whispered. The prints didn't come from the direction he'd arrived. They intersected the fox's path, almost as if they'd been walking together. Child and animal. But that was impossible, wasn't it? He knelt again, brushing around the tracks. Clear. Recent. Not yet iced over. And beside them, unmistakably more paw prints. No other human tracks. No adult footprints. No drag marks. Just two sets, side by side. They weren't fleeing. They were traveling. He stood slowly, the blanket clenched in his fist. Behind him, the wind picked up. The trees swayed. And far off, just on the edge of hearing, he thought he caught something. A voice, a laugh. He turned quickly. But there was nothing. Only the fox waiting. It had stopped again this time, on a ridge overlooking a shallow ravine. Logan approached. He dropped into a crouch beside the fox and peered down. Below the trees, parted slightly into a hollowed basin, a place the snow didn't reach, as heavily shielded by the way the rocks curved inward. And in the center, under a dense pine, something moved. A shadow. Logan reached instinctively for his binoculars, lifted them. His breath caught. It wasn't a person. It was a shape. Four-legged, larger than the fox. Still, but not dead. Sleeping. No. Watching. Even from this distance, he could feel it, those eyes locked on him. Another animal, but not a predator. A protector. Next to it, barely visible, a child's form curled against its side. Layla. Logan's heart slammed into his ribs. He exhaled, slow and shaking. I see you, he whispered. Then came the buzz. Low, electronic, faint but present. He dropped the binoculars. The fox's ears twitched. Logan turned sharply. Above them, far off toward the western sky, a small shape moved between the clouds. A drone. He dove sideways into the snow, pulling the fox with him. The buzzing grew, then faded. Logan's pulse hammered in his throat. They were being watched, not just by the wild, by something else. He lay still, heart-thudding snow clinging to his lashes. After a moment, he rose. The fox stood too. "We don't have much time," Logan said. He looked once more down the ravine toward the child and the beast. Then began the descent, step by step, into the unknown, into whatever came next. Because now he wasn't following the fox. He was following a purpose, and he wasn't going to stop. Not again. The wind dropped, just for a breath. Just enough for the forest to hold its silence. Logan's boots sank into snow up to the ankle as he crept along the narrowing ridge, the white fox just ahead. Its injured leg dragged a bit now, but it made no sound. No panting. No groans. It moved like silence had chosen it. Then it stopped. They stood on the edge of a sloped clearing, the snow untouched ahead. The wind paused once more, as if watching. Logan crouched, watching the fox closely. Then, unexpectedly, the fox lifted one paw and tapped the snow. Once. Twice. Pause. Then again, 3 quick taps. Tap, tap, pause, tap, tap, tap. Logan blinked. It did it again. Tap, tap, pause, tap, tap, tap. And again. He frowned, leaned closer. Tap, tap, pause, tap, tap, tap. Morse. Holy hell. He hadn't thought in Morse code in over 10 years. The cadence, buried deep like an old melody, suddenly resurfacing. 2 short. Pause. 3 short. Is. Logan reached for a stick clearing snow beside the fox drawing as the pattern repeated. He squinted, muttering. Ice. L. Another pause. Then again. This time ... U. Another burst. GES. T. Is lost. He stared, breath fogging the air. The fox had just tapped out a message. Is lost, he said out loud, testing the sound of it. Then the tapping resumed. Faster now. More complex. Dashes and dots layered with intentional spacing. Not random. Not instinct. Patterned. He began to draw them out in the snow line by line. M. P. The final sequence was more elaborate. Symbols arranged like coordinates. A V-shaped cluster. Then a sharp turn. Then downward strokes like ridges. A map. It hit him like a blow to the chest. He wasn't just reading signals, he was reading direction. The fox backed away from the message, looking at him expectantly. Logan stood. You're leading me somewhere. The fox turned and began moving again, this time faster, more urgent despite the injury. Logan followed, heart-pounding, trying to burn the pattern into memory. North, toward the frozen caverns, places even rangers avoided in the depth of winter. He'd been there once. Years ago. On a survival training exercise. The air was thin, the ice ancient, and the wind carried echoes that had no source. And now he was going back, his feet crunched over fresh powder. With every step, his mind reeled not just from what he'd seen, but from what it implied. Morse code, from a fox. It wasn't possible. But neither was a missing toddler leaving no footprints in snow. And neither was the unmistakable feeling crawling up his spine that he'd seen all this before. Not here. Not now. But years ago. Logan blinked, and suddenly he wasn't in the forest anymore. He was in Detroit. Rain on the windshield, red and blue lights strobing behind his eyelids. Sirens. A child's scream muffled by steel. It had been a warehouse extraction. 2 abducted kids, armed suspects, tight timeline. They had the girl, but the boy? He could still see the boy's face, 8 years old, maybe 9, peeking from behind a stack of crates. Eyes wide, trembling. Not in fear, in trust. That one pure expression of belief that Logan would get him out. He didn't. He hesitated, called for backup, protocol. By the time they breached, the boy was gone. Later, they found his body in the river. Logan never forgave himself. Not for the decision, but for the moment that followed. When he looked into the mirror that night and saw that part of himself that had decided not to act because he didn't want another failure on his record, that part of him was still alive. Until now, until Lila. He blinked the memory away and returned to the present just in time to catch the fox slowing ahead. It stood still in the snow, body tense, nose lifted. Logan paused, lowering his center of gravity. Something was nearby. The fox turned sharply right and padded to the base of a tree, thick-trunked ancient. Logan followed, eyes sweeping the branches. That's when he saw it. Half buried in snow, disguised as a knotted burl on the bark, was a black lens. Infrared camera, tiny, military grade. Camouflaged to blend in perfectly with the bark and shadow. Heat sensitive. Not a wildlife camera. He reached out slowly and pried it loose. No manufacturer logo. No ID number. Just a smooth black surface with a single green diode blinking. He turned it in his hand. There beneath a rubber seal was a transmitter. Live feed. Someone was watching. And it wasn't search and rescue. Logan's blood turned ice. He slid the camera into his coat, careful not to leave it exposed. He looked around the trees, scanning for others. The fox was already moving again, faster this time. Logan sprinted to catch up. He had a horrible thought. Someone didn't just want Lila back. Someone had been tracking her. And maybe not for the first time. His boots slipped on a patch of ice. He caught himself on a tree trunk, snow scattering. Above, a raven took flight wings, thunderclapping as it lifted from the canopy. The wind howled again, and beneath it, faint but real, a static hum. Another drone. Logan looked skyward, just a speck behind clouds, but too steady to be bird, hovering. He ducked beneath an overhang, pulling the fox with him. They crouched together, silent. The drone lingered, then drifted off. He exhaled. Then he looked at the fox. "You knew," he said. "You knew they were here." The fox stared. There was something ancient behind its gaze. Not wild, not tame, something aware. Logan leaned back against the bark. Everything felt like it was folding in on itself. Logic, law, biology. Nothing made sense. Except one thing. He had to get to that cave. He stood. The fox moved again, and Logan followed. The forest narrowed, trees pressing in closer, like ribs, wrapping around something vital. Logan began to notice more. Rocks placed in odd patterns, branches broken and set upright like sentinels, all too organized to be nature. Not human either. Messages, markers. He stopped once to study a trio of rocks arranged in a triangle. On one scratched into the surface was a symbol, an eye slashed. He didn't know what it meant, but it chilled him more than any military badge ever had. He moved faster. The fox now limped at a trot, driven, focused. Then through the trees, Logan saw it. The mouth of the cavern, jagged, narrow, a gash in the mountain's side. Snow drifted before it like breath. The air grew colder, and the light dimmed, though it was still afternoon. The fox stopped just short of the entrance. It didn't go in. It turned back to face Logan, and for the first time it made a sound. Not a growl, not a whimper, a soft, low chuff. Almost reverent. Logan swallowed hard. He looked toward the darkness. Something was waiting in there. Not just Lila, something else. And everything in his life had led to this moment. He stepped forward, one foot in the snow, one in the shadows, and crossed into the dark. They didn't speak. That was the first thing Logan noticed. No chatter, no muttered complaints, no calls for direction. Just boots in snow, synchronized, mechanical. He spotted them from behind the ridge, 3 figures moving between the trees like they'd rehearsed it. Tactical. Predatory. Each wore matte black gear jacket, pants, boots. All reinforced, but unmarked. No agency patches. No body cams. No emergency colors. Their helmets were dark faceplates, reflective, streamlined, with a curvature that made them look inhuman under low light. They weren't dressed for rescue. They were dressed for retrieval. Logan immediately dropped to the ground, grabbing the fox by the scruff and pulling it beside him, behind a low, moss-covered boulder, slick with ice. The fox didn't resist. It froze completely, like it understood the stakes. Not even its breath showed in the cold. Through the branches, Logan tracked the men. They moved in a triangle formation, scanning slowly, eyes forward, their steps timed to keep noise down. One of them swept a handheld device that pulsed with a faint green screen. EMF scanner, possibly thermal, definitely not civilian. Logan narrowed his eyes and felt the familiar burn creep into his chest, adrenaline coiled and precise. Not panic. Not anymore. He'd been trained for this, once, before he buried that life under layers of snow and whiskey and silence. He reached into his coat, unclipped the tiny parabolic mic from his belt, one of the few pieces of gear he kept powered by sheer distrust of the world, slid it over the rock, tapped in. Crackling, then voices, filtered but sharp. Area 4 clear, no tracks, no heat signatures. A pause, another voice deeper. Keep moving. They're on foot. Bio readings show intermittent movement, consistent with animal behavior. A third voice, clipped and dry. No chatter on civilian or law enforcement bands. Either the local sheriff's clueless or compliant. Logan's eyes sharpened. He recognized that tone. It wasn't law enforcement. It wasn't military. It was contract. He adjusted the frequency, isolating the feed again. Objective remains non-disclosure. If you see the subject, you don't call it in. Containment only. Silence all visual evidence. No press, no civilians, no leaks. The other voice responded instantly. Understood. Confirming directive, no engagement with child unless exposed. Confirmed. Target priority is non-human asset. Repeat, non-human asset. Logan's blood iced. They weren't searching for Lila. They were hunting the fox, or whatever they believed it was. He looked down. The animal hadn't flinched. It was still waiting, breathing slow. Its golden eyes never left the slope above. Then from the feed, a new sound. A fourth voice, remote, digitally filtered. Unit Sierra, new directive extraction window moved up. Asset movement detected near cavern mouth. Proceed silent. Use caution if the animal's awake, it remembers. Logan's mind raced. They knew where she was. They weren't racing to save her. They were racing to prevent something from being seen, or said, or shown. And they were willing to kill to do it. The fox turned its head toward him. Not urgently, knowingly. Logan nodded slowly. This wasn't just a rescue anymore. It was a cover-up, and they were walking straight into it. One of the agents passed just 10 feet from the rock, his boots silent on the crusted snow. He paused, eyes scanning the terrain. Then he raised his arm, gesturing silently. The group split, one veering left, one right, the leader heading forward. Logan exhaled soundlessly. He glanced to his left, a ridge. It would take them down through the ravine, the same path he'd mapped an hour ago from the Morse-like snow patterns. But if these men had access to satellite feeds, if they were tracking environmental disruptions like EMF fields and thermal shadows, then staying visible wasn't an option anymore. He tapped the fox gently. It moved, not a run, a glide. Low to the ground, hugging shadow and drift, it weaved through snow without leaving a trail. Logan followed. He crouch-walked, careful with each footfall, controlling breath and balance, keeping one hand on the pistol at his hip, not drawn, but present. The voices on the feed grew distant, then returned. The civilian heart status unknown. He's off-grid. Last documented incident 6 years ago. No confirmed sightings since. The third voice chimed in. If he's here and he's with it, it complicates everything. The digital voice returned, then removed complication. A coldness settled in Logan's gut. They knew his name. They had files. And if they had orders to silence, he didn't finish the thought. Instead, he moved faster. The fox ducked into a narrow thicket of fallen spruce limbs, wriggling through a crawl space between the trunks. Logan followed belly-flat snow soaking through his coat, pine needles brushing against his face. When they emerged on the other side, they were lower in the ravine, the sounds above muffled. Logan switched off the mic. Too dangerous now, too traceable. The fox led him to a pocket of old forest, deep pine, mossy boulders, silence so complete it rang. Logan stopped to breathe. His mind spun connecting threads. Military-grade trackers, blackout orders, non-human asset. And the fox, this impossibility in front of him. Injured, yes, but calm, knowing, communicative. It wasn't just an animal. It was something engineered, or evolved, or both. And Lila was part of it. Suddenly, he remembered her mother's voice in the radio broadcast, strained, broken. She didn't scream. There was no noise. She was just gone. Because she wasn't taken, she was guided. The fox circled back to him, then padded up a slope toward an overlook that revealed the mouth of the cavern system below. There it was, dark, silent, and crawling now with those same unmarked figures. They were already there. Logan counted 5, no 6. More had joined. Some carried large rectangular cases. Others set up small antenna clusters. He could see them deploying something, drones, no doubt. They weren't going in blind. They were preparing for extraction. Fast, clean, silent. His heart pounded in his ears. He'd never wanted to be a hero, but this wasn't about heroism. It was about truth. And about a child who reminded him far too much of the one he lost. He had a choice. Run or act. The fox didn't wait for him to decide. It turned and began back down the ridge. Toward the cave. Toward her. Logan followed. And for the first time in a very long time, he didn't hesitate. The cave mouth rose before them like a wound in the earth, jagged black and breathing cold. Logan stood motionless at the edge, his breath coming in visible clouds, boots planted in virgin snow. The silence around the entrance wasn't natural. It wasn't the hush of deep forest or snow-muted distance. It was older, heavier, like a place that hadn't been spoken into in centuries. The white fox moved first. It stepped forward on 3 legs, its injured paw held delicately above the snow. Its body passed the stone threshold with the solemnity of a priest walking into a sanctuary. Logan followed. The air inside was thinner, colder. Every exhale echoed off the walls, bouncing softly like memories, refusing to die. He drew his flashlight, clicked it on. The beam cut through the dark, catching flecks of mineral and frost along the stone. The walls were smooth in places, ribbed in others, suggesting ice had lived here long before men ever found it. The path narrowed quickly, forcing him to sidestep between 2 columns of stone that looked almost sculpted by design. Like they weren't made by nature, but remembered by it. The fox stopped again. It looked back at him, amber eyes steady, then turned into a low side passage on the right. He hesitated, then followed, ducking low. Inside the cave, opened into a small chamber, half lit by the weak glow of his flashlight, bouncing off the ice. And there, against the far wall beneath an overhang of rock that resembled a cradle, sat a small figure. Layla. Logan stopped breathing. She was seated cross-legged in the snow, her back straight, hands on her knees, eyes open and unblinking. Not in fear, not in confusion, in focus. Her tiny face was illuminated faintly by the reflection of light off the cave wall, giving her skin a soft, ethereal glow. She wasn't shivering despite the temperature. She wasn't crying. She wasn't calling for help. She was listening to what Logan couldn't say. Her gaze was locked on the wall ahead of her bare stone. But her eyes shimmered as if watching something alive, something invisible. Her lips moved, but no sound came. Then slowly, as Logan stepped forward, crunching the frost beneath his boots, she blinked, turned, and looked at him. Their eyes met. There was no fear in hers, no surprise, only recognition. She tilted her head slightly, then smiled. Not the smile of a frightened child being rescued, but the calm, quiet smile of someone who had been waiting, expecting. Then she spoke. One word, soft, breathy, echo. The fox stepped out of the shadows. Lila's face brightened. Her small body shifted forward, arms opening slowly, like she was welcoming an old friend. The fox crossed this chamber in deliberate steps. There was no urgency, no hesitation. Each footfall landed soundlessly in the snow. It came to a stop before her, bowed its head gently, and leaned in. Lila leaned forward, forehead first. And in a movement that felt older than language, the fox pressed its brow to hers. The touch was so light, so slow, Logan barely registered it. But in that instant, the air changed. Something moved. Something unseen. A pulse that started at the point of contact and radiated outward like heat through cold stone. It passed through Logan's chest like a shiver through the walls, like breath. He stepped back without meaning to. The cave was suddenly warmer. Not in temperature, but in feeling. Like the heart of it had awakened. Layla closed her eyes. The fox did too. They remained like that, connected for several long seconds. Then Lila whispered, voice feather light. He's not just a fox. Logan opened his mouth, but no words came. Lila placed her small hand on the fox's cheek. He showed me everything, she said. Before I got cold. What do you mean? Logan asked gently, his voice hoarse in the chamber. She looked at him as if only now realizing she'd spoken out loud. Her expression was solemn, ancient almost. Not something that belonged on a child's face. He found me. I was outside. Then I wasn't scared anymore. She reached into her jacket a tiny fleece coat that had somehow remained buttoned and pulled out something clutched in her fist. It was a stone. Smooth, flat, almost metallic. It shimmered faintly, even in low light. Logan stepped forward. Where did you get that? Layla looked down at it. It was in the snow. He pushed it to me with his nose. The fox sat still beside her, eyes closed, breathing even. Logan knelt beside them, taking the object gently. It wasn't a rock. It was a tag, a dog tag. But not military issue. The shape was similar oval. But the markings were etched, not stamped. Strange symbols surrounded the center, a pattern that pulsed when the light shifted. And in the center, one word, echo. Logan turned it over. Blank. His mind raced. Was this part of the program? Some experiment gone rogue? Some embedded device? He looked back at Lila. Did he talk to you? She nodded. Not like us. Like... She paused, thoughtful. Like music in my chest. Like stories I forgot I remembered. Logan stared at her. That wasn't metaphor. Not from her. That was experience. Something real had passed between them. He looked at the fox again. It met his gaze now, eyes calm. Logan swallowed. Who are you? The fox blinked once. And then for the first time, it made a sound. A hum, low, subsonic, like a purr laced with frequency. It filled the cave, vibrating through the stone, through Logan's bones. Not noise, not echo. Something in between. And when it stopped, Logan understood something terrifying and beautiful at once. The fox remembered. It remembered places it had never seen, faces it had never touched. It remembered Lila. Not from this life. From before. The air shifted again. A low groan echoed through the cave walls, a warning perhaps, or an arrival. Logan stood, instincts flaring. He turned off his flashlight, lowering the beam. Footsteps. Outside. Crunching. Precise. The hunters had arrived. He crouched quickly, motioning for silence, not that anyone needed the reminder. The fox stood and positioned itself directly in front of Lila. Not to attack. To shield. The steps drew closer. Muffled voices, now radio chatter, clipped and encrypted. They're close. EM pulse indicates residual charge. Thermal scan confirms 1 adult. 1 child. No third reading. Asset likely dampening own signal. Then, orders remain. No survivors. Logan's heart pounded. He looked to the side wall, an old memory triggering. A tunnel. Narrow. Twisting. A ranger once told him about these caves built like ant trails. Long, winding escape routes for glacial melt thousands of years ago. He turned to Lila. We're going deeper, he whispered. Can you walk? She nodded, stood. The fox didn't move. It stayed in place. Not without him, Layla said. He's not coming with us, Logan replied. Why not? The fox turned. Logan understood in that moment it wasn't afraid of the men. It was delaying them. It was giving them time. No, he said quietly. He's staying. Lila's lip trembled. He's my echo. Logan touched her shoulder. And you're his reason. Then he turned and led her into the dark. Behind them, the fox remained in the chamber, framed by stone and memory eyes locked on the shadows approaching. As they slipped deeper into the tunnels, Lila whispered again. He said, he was made to remember. Logan looked down at her. And you, she smiled faintly. I was made to believe him. And the darkness took them in. The tunnel narrowed, walls squeezing tighter as Logan moved deeper into the mountain's veins. Every breath scraped against cold stone. Behind him, Lila clutched his hand, small and steady, her footfalls matching his. She didn't cry. She didn't ask questions. It was as if she already knew where they were going, and the fox echo remained behind. The guilt weighed heavier than his back. Eventually, the tunnel widened into a rounded chamber. It felt like stepping into the lung of some sleeping beast, quiet, vast, and thick with time. Logan swept his flashlight across the walls. They weren't natural. Smooth cuts, angles, not built by humans but carved with intent. At the far end, half buried in a stone shelf, sat a metal case. The edges were worn corners, dulled by decades of erosion, but it hadn't rusted. Still intact. Lila pointed. That's where it sings. Logan frowned. What? She tilted her head. The walls. They hum when you get close. He stepped forward slowly. No hum, but something pulled at him behind the chest bone the way static pulls before lightning. His watch buzzed. The old solar-powered face blinked once, then again, then flatlined. Then the screen glowed faint blue. New characters flickered across the display. Input verified. User heart. Echo override detected. Logan stepped back. What the hell? The case hissed softly and a panel slid open on its top. Inside a circular pad, glass-like ringed with filaments. He glanced at Lila, then back down. Reached forward and placed the watch face first onto the reader. A low tone began. Then the walls lit up, not with light, but with movement. One section shimmered and expanded like glass, rippling with breath, revealing an embedded screen. A video interface. The top corner blinked. File reclaimed operation, echo protocol, level redacted. A black frame, then static, then a voice. Female, cool, controlled, Project Echo. Log entry, number 0149. Initiated under directive Helios. The screen snapped into focus. A lab, sterile, white, brutal in its cleanliness. A child sat on one side of a glass room. No older than Lila. Attached to her temple, small silver nodes blinked in rhythmic pulses. On the other side of the glass, a cage. Inside, a white fox pup. Trembling. Subject A003. The voice narrated, introduced to animal pair 001 white. Objective synchronized biometric feedback under simulated stress. On screen, a loud blast went off. The child flinched. The fox yelped, cowering. Result failure. No cognitive bridge established. The video jumped. Test iteration 14. Subject B019. Synchronization threshold achieved at 62%. Emotional translation poor. Result terminated. Another jump. Now the room held a toddler with thick auburn curls. Layla, even younger, maybe a year old. Her eyes half-lidded like she was dreaming awake. On the other side of the glass, the same fox. Older now, not afraid. Still, subject L003, alias Lila Summers. Initiated under trial variance with specimen 001. Target persistent empathy link. Layla on screen lifted her hand. The fox mirrored her. Simultaneously, no signal, no sound. Synchronization achieved 97.8%. The room fell silent. The narrator's voice returned, this time strained. Unexpected outcome. Link formed prior to standard conditioning. Subject responds emotionally to animal distress. Animal responds to nonverbal emotive shifts. Another jump. This time men in suits crowded around a boardroom table. The video shaky recorded in secret. One man spoke. This exceeds the objective. If an animal can carry memory, instinct, and protectiveness without command, this isn't an asset. It's a liability. Another man, older, colder. Terminate the animal. Reassign the child. Memory is imprintable. But the link is mutual now, a woman said. Echo won't forget her, and she won't let go of him. A beat. Then burn the facility. The footage cut. Silence returned to the cave, except for Logan's own breathing now, shallow. Lila's voice broke the stillness. They told me he was a dream, she said softly. That foxes don't talk. That memories aren't alive. Logan knelt beside her. How much of this do you remember? She looked at him through him. I remember everything. He reached out, took her hand. They did this to you. She nodded. Because they didn't think I'd survive. And when I did, they made him disappear. Logan swallowed hard. His thoughts spiraled. They'd tried to weaponize a bond, not just between man and beast, but between child and something beyond human structure. Something instinctual, sacred. And when it worked too well, they buried it. He turned back to the screen. Another video queued up automatically. This time a montage raw test logs. A whiteboard with equations. A fox pup, tail broken, being healed slowly through the presence of Lila. A soldier in the background, face blurred, but Logan recognized the stance, the stillness. Caleb, Lila's father. In the final clip, he knelt beside the fox, whispering, "Take care of her. Promise me." Then an explosion. Screams. Metal twisting. Static. End. The screen faded. Logan stood in silence, letting the weight press down. This wasn't just a cover-up. This was erasure. An entire program deleted because it threatened the wrong kind of control. The kind born from love. He turned to Lila. They'll come for you. Again. She nodded. But Echo will come back. He stayed behind so we could escape. He's not done yet, she whispered. Logan closed the case, clipped the solar watch back to his wrist. We're not done either. And for the first time, Logan Hart, the man who once let a child die to protect a mission, decided this time the mission would be worth dying for. The drone came first. It sliced through the snow-drenched sky like a needle through cloth, silent white, nearly invisible save for the blinking diode on its underside. From above the ridge, it hovered, scanning the terrain with clinical precision. Heat signatures, movement patterns, electromagnetic traces, it caught everything. And it found them. A faint ping echoed from the device, relayed instantly to the strike team several miles below. Inside their mobile command unit, Agent Rowe lifted his head from the monitor. They're on the move, he said into the comms. Grid 19 Alpha. Confirmed heat 3 signatures. He stared at the screen. One tall one, small one low to the ground. He tapped the screen, once eyes narrowing. And the fox is still with them. On the ridge above the cavern mouth, snow blew sideways like smoke. Logan burst into view, Lila strapped tightly to his back, her arms around his neck, her cheek pressed against the rough canvas of his jacket. She didn't cry. She didn't speak. She just held on. The fox limped just behind, barely keeping pace, but it never faltered. Every few steps it glanced backward, ears pinned flat. It could feel them coming. Logan knew it too. The air felt different now, charged tense, as if the trees themselves were leaning away from the path ahead. The shadows were alive with motion. Not natural motion, tactical. He slid down a steep embankment, boots, cutting long grooves into the snow, landing hard beside a fallen tree. The ground dipped suddenly into a narrow gorge, half-frozen stream, cutting through steep on both sides. He didn't hesitate. He crossed. His legs plunged through ice-crust boots, soaking, but he moved fast, never slipping. Behind him, the fox made the jump in a single bound, landing in snow and sliding. Then came the crack. A rifle shot, sharp and immediate. The fox yelped. It stumbled. Blood hit the snow in 3 perfect drops before the creature recovered its footing and ran again. Logan spun mid-step, eyes wide. Echo. The fox didn't respond. It just ran harder. Another shot hit a tree trunk to Logan's left, splinters spraying. They were here. He pressed forward, adrenaline flooding his limbs. Lila's grip tightened. I'm okay, she whispered, somehow calm. He's okay. Logan didn't know if she meant Echo or herself, but he needed to move. He hit the edge of the next incline, too steep to climb directly. He dropped Lila gently behind a log. Stay down. He knelt, yanked open the pouch on his belt, and pulled out the device he'd kept since Detroit, a compact flash grenade he'd never turned in when he left the agency. He'd modified it. Reduced light, increased sound. It wasn't meant to blind. It was meant to confuse. He twisted the timer dial to 3 seconds. Slid it beneath a layer of pine needles 30 feet behind him. Wiped the snow to obscure any disturbance. He turned back, eyes scanning the tree line above. Movement. 3 dark shapes. They were faster now. Not hunting. Closing. He scooped Lila into his arms. Close your eyes. Cover your ears. She obeyed. He ran. Behind them, the grenade detonated. Not a boom. A burst. Light flickered like a camera bulb, 20 times a second. The sound emitted a high-frequency shriek, inaudible to most humans, but strong enough to disrupt tactical comms and earpieces. Logan didn't look back. The fox limped beside him, breath wheezing now, red soaking into the snow beneath it. They reached the base of the next ridge. He turned, scanned Lila's body. There, just beneath her jacket collar, a faint bulge. Tracker. He dropped to his knees, pulled out his knife. The blade glinted once in the moonlight. He hesitated. Then he sliced. The fabric split, revealing a circular disc the size of a nickel embedded just under the stitching. A biothermal transponder, military grade. Buried inside the jacket itself. No wonder the drone had found them so fast. He yanked it free and stuffed it into the mouth of his canteen. He looked around, eyes scanning for a place to dump it. Then he saw it, a deep crevice in the ice wall to his left. He hurled the canteen inside, watching it tumble into the void. Then he grabbed Lila again and ran. Behind them, the team reached the clearing. One soldier raised his rifle, tracking the heat signature, then paused. The signal had vanished. Lost thermal, he barked into the comms. Another voice crackled, repeat. Target dropped. They dumped the tracker. Back in the ravine, Logan and the fox cut left into a narrow deer trail, thick with low branches and thorny underbrush. It slowed their pace, but it also shielded them from aerial view. The fox stumbled once, then again. It collapsed. Logan skidded to a stop. The animal lay still, sides heaving. Blood trickled from its shoulder, staining the snow bright. Lila slid down from Logan's back and dropped beside the fox, wrapping her arms around its neck. Please, she whispered. Please don't stop. The fox's eye fluttered open. It didn't try to rise, but it didn't look away. Logan ripped open his med pack, pulling gauze and sealant. He worked fast, years of training and field trauma coming back like muscle memory. He packed the wound, wrapped it tight, applied coagulant foam, and secured the limb with a splint fashioned from a snapped branch. The fox breathed slower now. Still alive, still with them, but barely. "We need to go," Logan said. Leela nodded, silent. She climbed back onto his back. The fox stood, shaking, but upright. They pressed on. Every step now was deliberate, every breath measured. They had no margin left, but Logan could feel it. The enemy had lost their scent. The woods were hiding them again. For now, he turned to look back at the path they'd taken, a trail of blood, a scattering of pine needles, the echo of something ancient and quiet and powerful. Not a rescue mission, a revolt. And the hunt was far from over. By dawn, the snow had turned to glass. The world was silent, not from peace, but from exhaustion. Every tree, every frozen creek, every buried stone seemed to be holding its breath. The storm had passed, but its shadow still lingered in the pale blue light before sunrise. Logan moved in steady strides now, no longer sprinting, no longer ducking for cover. His breath came slow, deliberate. His steps calculated. Behind the lines of fatigue in his eyes, something had clicked into place. A choice. Final. Unflinching. Lila slept lightly on his back, wrapped in the fox's old thermal blanket. Her arms draped over his shoulders, her cheek resting against the back of his neck. She hadn't spoken in hours. She didn't need to. The way her heartbeat pressed into his spine said enough. The fox Echo walked beside them, or tried to. It limped heavily now, the dressing Logan had applied already soaked red. Every few steps, its back leg dragged. Sometimes it faltered, sometimes it stopped completely. But every time Logan paused, Echo found the strength to continue. It wasn't following instinct anymore. It was following purpose. They were close. Just beyond the trees ahead, past a stretch of broken ground and a ravine choked with dead pines, lay the border. Not an official checkpoint, not the kind with guards or fences. This was a smuggler's path. A long abandoned timber bridge spanning a frozen gorge that divided Montana from the Canadian wilds. Built by lumber companies decades ago, forgotten after the railroad shifted west. No cameras, no patrols, just silence and snow. It was their only way out, and Logan knew it was now or never. If he brought Lila back into the world, into hospitals, government offices, news feeds, she would vanish. Not publicly, not immediately, but inevitably. Somewhere behind black sight walls and smiling men in suits who promised everything and delivered silence. She'd become a file, a subject, a legacy program buried under redacted memos and sealed folders. An Echo. They'd dissect him, not for vengeance, for understanding. That was worse. He stopped at the tree line. Down below, the bridge waited. Weathered. Tilting slightly. A single track of snow already dusting its planks. Beyond that, nothing but forest. The kind of deep, ancient Canadian timberland where people disappeared and systems lost interest. He could vanish there. He'd done it once. He could do it again. But this time he wouldn't be hiding from shame. He'd be protecting something worth running toward. Logan crouched and gently unbuckled the harness from around his shoulders. Lila stirred, blinked up at him. "We're almost there," he said, brushing hair from her face. She looked around, then over at the fox who was sitting in the snow 10 feet behind them, panting shallowly. Her face crumpled. "He can't make it," she said. Logan didn't answer. He knew. They both did. He stood slowly and walked to Echo. The fox didn't rise. It just watched him, head tilted slightly. Logan knelt, pulling at a fresh strip of gauze from his pack, wrapping it around the soaked bandage. The fox flinched once, but didn't pull away. "I should have known you wouldn't quit," Logan said softly. Echo blinked, then almost imperceptibly leaned forward, nose brushing against Logan's wrist. It wasn't thanks. It was farewell. Logan felt the breath catch in his throat. He tightened the final wrap, then leaned back on his heels. "You don't have to do this," he murmured. But he knew that was a lie. Some promises outlived bodies. Some missions chose their own endings. He stood and turned to Leela. "We have to go." She nodded once. But then, just as they took their first step toward the bridge, Echo stood. Unsteadily, slowly. But he stood. And he followed. Every step was pain. Every movement a defiance of biology. But he came. They crossed the clearing in silence. 3 silhouettes cutting through the mist, rising from the snow. The bridge creaked under their weight. Lila looked down once, and whimpered ice cracked along the planks, the chasm below, 100 feet of jagged stone. "Don't look down," Logan said. She didn't. They were halfway across, when the fox stopped again, this time for good. He sank down slowly onto his side, his chest rising and falling in shallow pulses. Lila turned. "Echo." He didn't respond. She ran to him, dropped to her knees. Logan followed, heart-thudding. Lila pressed her hands to the fox's fur, tears falling onto his side. "Please, we're almost there." The fox opened one eye and looked at her, then at Logan, and then behind them, back the way they'd come. The message was clear. "I'll stay," it said without words. "I'll hold them here." Logan turned slowly. through the trees beyond the clearing movement. Faint, but real. Figures, distant. They were coming. He looked back down. The fox's eyes locked onto his. And Logan, former agent, former coward, former ghost, understood what he was being asked. He crouched beside them. "I won't forget," he said. Lila pressed her forehead to the fox's. He licked her cheek once, then closed his eyes. She stood, tears streaking her face, and walked back to Logan. She didn't look back. She couldn't. Together they crossed the bridge. Behind them, Echo didn't move. Not even as the wind picked up, shaking the ice from the trees. Not even as the sounds of pursuit echoed down the ridge. He lay there still, silent, a sentinel. When Logan and Lila reached the other side, the forest swallowed them whole. And for the first time since it began, they were free. The snow swallowed sound like a secret. Back on the ridge above the border bridge, the trees creaked under their icy burdens. Wind howled through broken pines, twisting drifts into shifting white ghosts. And somewhere in that frozen silence, Echo moved. The fox no longer ran to escape. He ran to be seen. Through thickets and ravines, he dragged his wounded body forward, every stride a rebellion against death. Blood soaked into the snow beneath him, dark and deliberate, leaving a trail like ink on a white page. It was bait. He was writing a story one meant for the ones who followed. Behind him, the men in black spread out in formation. Scanning rifles raised thermal sensors flickering with heat signatures. Visual on target one said through comms. Another confirmed asset moving west away from bridge. Alone. No child, no civilian. From their perspective, the fox was exactly what they wanted. Isolated, slow, vulnerable. They didn't know they were being led. Echo reached a clearing, a low basin carved by wind and erosion, and stopped at its center. His chest rose and fell in shallow gasps, his eyes fixed on the tree line. He waited. The first figure appeared seconds later, emerging from the snow fog like a ghost in armor. Rifle raised. The second flanked left. The third approached from behind. They encircled him. Target acquired, the lead said. Containment in progress. He stepped closer. Echo didn't move until the last second. With one surge of strength, he bolted straight toward the trees on the far side. The agents followed fast. Confident, unaware they were following a dying animal, into the one place the satellite couldn't reach, a cluster of iron-rich basalt that disrupted their signals. Masked heat shattered radio lines. Within 60 seconds, all three agents vanished from command view. Within 90, so did Echo. And in the storm that followed, neither were seen again. Back across the border, deep in the shelter of Canadian pine, Logan felt the silence arrive like thunder. He was miles away now, boot-soaked lungs burning. He looked back once toward the mountain. Nothing but white. No shapes, no movement. Just stillness. He knew what had happened. He didn't say it. He didn't have to. Beside him, Lila stood wrapped in layers too big for her hands balled into fists inside his coat sleeves. She stared at the horizon, unblinking. "Do you feel it?" she asked. Logan nodded. "I do." They never spoke his name again. They didn't need to. 5 years passed like snow through branches, quiet, constant, unnoticed by the rest of the world. In a village called Saint-Émilie, population 312, Logan Hart became Owen Clark, a retired forestry consultant who lived at the edge of the woods with his daughter Mira. They were quiet, friendly enough, but private. Owen walked with a limp he hadn't had before. Mira was homeschooled and rarely spoke unless she knew you well. No one asked questions. In places like that, survival earned you silence. Their home was small, a timber cabin with a tin roof and a view of the lake that turned to glass every September. Mira grew strong, fast, endlessly curious. She built snow forts that resembled bunkers. She trained birds to take crumbs from her fingertips. She learned how to read trees like stories and clouds like maps. But she always drew foxes. White ones. They were everywhere, on the margins of her notebooks, on the back of napkins, and chalk on the sidewalk. Some had wings. Some had scars. All had the same golden eyes. "He's still with me," she'd whisper sometimes, mostly when she was alone. One day, Logan found a page on her desk, a fox curled protectively around a sleeping child. At the bottom in her handwriting, just 3 words. "He remembers everything." He folded the page and kept it in his coat pocket. Years passed. Governments changed. Programs folded. Names were erased from databases. But some truths refused to die. And in the quiet of the Saint-Émilie woods, where the wind still howled like a memory and the trees stood like sentinels, Mira Clark would sometimes stop mid-play, look into the pines, and smile at nothing, because she knew. Somewhere beyond what could be seen, a promise was still being kept. It happened on a Tuesday, the quiet kind of day that didn't warn you something irreversible was coming. The fire had died down to glowing embers in the hearth. The lake outside was still rimmed with ice that hadn't quite melted even though spring was crawling in. The trees were beginning to whisper again, not warnings, but invitations. Inside the cabin, Logan lay on the small bed he'd built himself. A simple pine frame, a wool blanket, nothing extravagant. He'd always preferred the silence of useful things. He wasn't in pain anymore. Not really. Whatever illness had started in his chest had taken its time climbing through him, months of decline masked behind his usual silence. He didn't want Lila to know. Not until the very end. She sat by his side now, 8 years old. Strong, clear-eyed. A wildness in her that no one could extinguish, not even time. She held his hand, small fingers wrapped around calloused knuckles. "You don't have to be scared," she said softly. He smiled barely. "I'm not." She leaned forward, her forehead against his. Just like she had done once long ago in a cave with a fox. "I'll remember everything," she whispered. "I know you will," he said. "You always did." And then his breath went out like a candle. No gasp, no struggle. Just stillness. She didn't cry. She sat beside him until the sun touched the lake, then turned gold, then vanished. That night she packed. Not clothes, not toys, but memory. In the wooden box her father had carved the first winter they'd arrived. Small, sturdy, with a brass latch, she placed what mattered. A photograph of a younger Logan laughing in sunlight, holding a baby wrapped in a thermal blanket. The military-style watch with the solar dial. The data drive he had once hidden from the world, labeled in her own handwriting, Echo, Directive Helios. 3 folded drawings, all of a white fox. And a letter she had spent weeks writing, even before he passed. On the lid of the box, she carved the words, "Echo must be told." By sunrise, she was gone. No one saw her leave. That was how she wanted it. The package arrived on the desk of a freelance journalist in Missoula 10 days later. Cass Holloway had seen plenty of mail before fan theories, death threats, conspiracy rants. She rarely opened unmarked parcels. But something about this one felt different. No return address. Only one word scrawled across the top. Truth. She opened it slowly, hands calloused from years of climbing fences and carrying cameras in the wrong corners of the world. Inside she found the letter. She read it once. Then again. She didn't move for 20 minutes. She called no one. Instead, she cleared her desk, pulled the old hardline laptop from under her bed, and inserted the drive. The folder exploded open. Video files, audio logs, encrypted documents, photos dated back 15 years, some clearly taken inside military-grade laboratories, others grainy and smuggled. One image made her freeze. A child, no older than 3, forehead pressed gently against the brow of a white fox. The metadata tags were clear. Project Echo, subject Elzer, specimen Zo1. She opened one video. A briefing. Dark-suited officials discussing synchronization thresholds, weaponization of emotional linkages, the risk of autonomous intelligence arising through unintended bonding. The phrase, neurological empathy construct, repeated again and again. Cass closed the video. She sat back. This wasn't a story. It was a reckoning. She reached for her recorder. "This is Cass Holloway. Timestamp 0900 hours. I am currently reviewing materials related to a declassified black site project referred to internally as Echo Protocol. If what I've seen is real, this isn't just a government experiment gone wrong. It's a redefinition of the relationship between human cognition and animal consciousness." Her voice trembled, not from fear, from awe. 3 days later, the file was uploaded to a secure leak portal used by international media watchdogs. Verified. Duplicated. Released. The world didn't stop, but something inside it shifted. Cable news didn't report it at first. Too strange. Too unbelievable. But the science journals noticed. The ethicists noticed. And eventually the survivors noticed. Families who'd lost loved ones to unexplained government raids. Biologists who'd studied anomalous animal behaviors. Former handlers of service animals who spoke of emotional bonds that defied logic. Then came the whistleblowers. People who had buried the truth finally stepped into the light. And the story grew teeth. But amid all the noise, only one thing mattered. The girl. The one who vanished. The one who returned. The one who whispered to foxes and carried memory like a compass. No one knew where she was. Not exactly. But sometimes deep in the Montana woods, hikers would report strange sightings. A girl in a green coat with amber eyes. A white fox running through snow that hadn't yet fallen. And once, just once, a voice heard on the wind, soft as snow melt, saying, "He's still here." The truth didn't explode. It crept. The first articles surfaced on fringe websites, those tucked between conspiracy boards, and homegrown science blogs, the kind no one took seriously unless they were looking for something to believe in. They called it The Fox That Vanished, or The Silent Bond, or Echo the Program. They buried in ice. No one mainstream paid attention, not at first. Journalists dismissed it as fan fiction spun out of PTSD-laced veterans or digital storytellers gone too far. Editors passed with a laugh. Social media flagged it as uncorroborated content. But the footage didn't stop circulating. People saw the eyes. That was the turning point. One particular video, grainy infrared, captured from a drone not meant to be recording, surfaced through a leak site and found its way into the bloodstream of the internet. It wasn't long, maybe 30 seconds. But it was undeniable. A child no more than 2 crossing a narrow mountain ledge during a blizzard. No human in sight. just her, barely visible, cradled under the sweeping arch of a low-hanging pine, and next to her, a fox. Not a red blur of instinct and chaos, but a white figure walking slowly ahead of her, pausing, looking back. Its tail swept snow as it moved. Its gait was deliberate, protective. The timestamp on the drone said it was captured just hours after the official Frost Ridge search was called off. The metadata confirmed the coordinates: Montana, winter storm, year of Lila's disappearance. Suddenly, the story no longer belonged to the underground. Major outlets scrambled to respond, some denying, some spinning, but all suddenly aware they were behind. How did a toddler survive the storm? Where is she now? Was there really a military experiment? Headlines multiplied. Podcasts emerged overnight. Theories spiraled. Debates erupted. But through all of it, the question persisted. Stubborn, aching, unshakable. What really happened in the snow that year? A woman named Karen Reyes, a retired drone operator, came forward anonymously. Her voice was disguised, but her words were steel. They told us not to record, she said in a transcript leaked to the press. Said it was a wildlife anomaly, nothing worth tagging. But it wasn't wildlife. I've been around every kind of animal surveillance. That fox, he didn't move like an animal. He moved like someone who knew what he was protecting. Her interview trended for days before being pulled. But it didn't matter. The internet had already copied, cached, and reposted it 1,000 times. Back in Washington, denials mounted. We have no knowledge of any such operation. All references to Directive Helios are fabrications. The footage has not been authenticated, but the public wasn't listening anymore. They were watching the way the girl placed her hand on the fox's side as they passed through the wind. Watching the way he leaned into her, not as an animal trained, but as a creature who chose. More files surfaced, scrubbed reports, ghosted names, logbooks recovered from buried servers. Journalists cross-referenced timestamps with abandoned research contracts. And then came the biggest breach yet, a full segment of internal footage from the Helios project. Not just documents, video. One scene played again and again across every corner of the web. A soldier kneeling beside a child and a fox whispering something inaudible. Behind him, fire bloomed through broken glass. The child screamed. The fox didn't run. It stood. Between the child and the blaze, people saw that. And the narrative changed. It was no longer about military secrets or neurological implants or rogue black sites. It was about something ancient, something sacred. What does it mean when a creature, something built from instinct and blood and wildness, chooses to protect a child not out of training, but love? What does it say about us? Lila's name resurfaced in stages. First as rumor, then in speculation, and finally in a leaked file too detailed to ignore hospital records under a false name, matching height and birth data, linking her recovery to a rural clinic just miles from the Canadian border. Authorities denied. The clinic refused comment, but the handwriting on the intake form was enough for anyone who'd ever seen Logan Hart's field notes. It matched. And then came the question no one wanted to ask, but couldn't avoid. If the fox was real, where was he now? Was he dead, alive, hidden, or worse, taken? The silence around that question became its own kind of noise. Protests broke out outside federal facilities. Demands were made for accountability. A petition calling for full declassification of the ECHO protocol reached 3 million signatures in a week. None of it brought the fox back. None of it brought Logan back. But something had changed. Something had cracked open and refused to close. In a small radio studio tucked in a corner of Missoula, Cass Holloway ended her latest podcast episode with a whisper. Some truths don't need to be proven, she said, voice thick with quiet defiance. They only need to be remembered. And then after a beat, if you're out there, Lila, thank you. She paused. For all of us. 1 week later, a package arrived at the station. No return address. Inside a sketch. Childlike but vivid. A white fox curled around a girl's feet. A single line written in the corner. He still remembers you. And beneath that, Echo doesn't forget. The world kept spinning. But those who'd seen the snow that year. Those who'd followed the tracks through silence. Those who'd whispered to shadows and believed. They knew. They always knew. The auditorium in Helena, Montana wasn't large, but it felt cavernous that night. Rows of faces. Scientists, journalists, veterans, parents with small children on their laps sat in rapt silence as a single spotlight bathed the stage in amber. A snowstorm whispered against the windows behind them, soft and relentless, as if time itself had circled back. A figure stepped up to the podium. She was young, barely 14, but her presence carried a gravity beyond years. Tall for her age, with deep-set eyes the color of winter bark, and dark hair tied back in a braid that had survived 1,000 questions. Lila. Not the lost girl from the storm, not the symbol on every magazine cover. Just Lila. She stood alone at the center, wearing a woolen green coat 2 sizes too big, Logan's coat. In her hand was a folded piece of paper. She didn't look down at it once. Her voice was steady low. 5 years ago, I disappeared in the middle of a blizzard. A murmur passed through the crowd. I was 2 years old. Too young to remember, they said. But some memories don't live in the brain. They live in the body, the blood, the silence. A pause. The room didn't breathe. I remember the cold, but not as pain, as shape, as silence that hummed like a lullaby. I remember a cave. I remember being watched. Her eyes swept the room, and I remember him. She didn't need to say the name. Everyone knew. A single image was projected behind her hand, drawn simple childlike, but clear. A white fox eyes, wide tail, curled standing before a child. I'm not here to accuse. Not anymore, Lila continued. I'm here to say that what happened wasn't an accident. It wasn't random. It wasn't just military failure or ethical collapse or secrets buried in snow. It was something older. A man in the front row, a retired biologist from the Department of Wildlife, leaned forward, barely blinking. Lila's voice tightened. They taught us that real connection is anecdotal, that you can't measure loyalty in brainwaves, that a fox doesn't protect a child unless it's tricked or trained or genetically manipulated. She let that land. But what if some creatures were born for something else? A ripple ran through the audience. What if the point wasn't control? What if the experiment failed because it succeeded in a way they didn't predict? On the screen behind her, the slide changed. A video played grainy, but real. A white blur walking beside a child in a storm. Snow slanting sideways. A gust of wind lifting the child's hood and the fox pausing, turning, waiting. The room fell deeper into silence. Then Lila stepped away from the podium. She looked smaller somehow until she turned back. I don't have all the answers, she said. But I know this. I wasn't saved because someone found me. I was saved because someone remembered a promise. Her voice cracked just once, and kept it. The audience didn't clap. They stood, in complete silence, not as applause, as respect, a reverence only truth can earn. That night, the sky over Montana broke open with stars. Lila walked out alone down the snowy steps of the hall. The collar of Logan's coat pulled up high against the wind. Her breath came in soft clouds. Her boots crunched a rhythm known only to her. The mountains were darker than she remembered, but they didn't scare her. She climbed a narrow path off the main road, the one Logan used to call the Quiet Spine, a route he'd said led nowhere important. But he was wrong. It led here, to this moment, to a ridge, where the trees opened wide and the world held its breath. She stopped. The wind shifted, and there, barely visible against the pale canvas of snow, stood a shadow. Not moving, not breathing, just waiting. A white fox, older now, grayer around the eyes. Its form blurred at the edges, not from snow, but from something less explainable, like memory layered on memory. Lila didn't speak. She didn't need to. She stepped forward once. The fox raised its head. Their eyes locked. It wasn't a reunion. It was a vow reborn. And then as the wind howled down from the peak, the fox turned, walked to the edge, paused, and vanished into the storm. Not as prey, not as myth, but as keeper. The final shot held on Lila. Standing alone, her breath slow, the storm coiling behind her like smoke. Then the screen went black, a beat of silence. Then one line faded in, echo remains. And the promise was never forgotten.